Welcome. We're jumping straight into a deep dive today, really digging into one specific, intense chapter, Jeremiah 34.
It's quite the chapter, really dramatic.
Absolutely. So let's set the scene for you. Picture Jerusalem. It's under siege. The Babylonian army, Nebuchadnezzar's army, is right outside.
Tightening the noose, basically.
Right? And inside, you've got King Zedekiah. He's watching his kingdom crumble. And it's not just Jerusalem. The text mentions the Babylonians are also fighting the last couple of fortified cities still holding out.
Lachish and Azekah, they get a specific mention. The last holdouts.
So our mission today is really to unpack the key messages, the events in this chapter during this, incredibly critical time and figure what it's all saying.
It's a pressure cooker. And right away, the text throws us into a major event. A direct message from God, delivered by Jeremiah straight to King Zedekiah himself.
Okay, let's start there then. What's this prophecy? What does it say is coming for Zedekiah and, well, for the city?
Well, the message is pretty blunt, stark even. Jerusalem will fall to the king of Babylon, no question.
Hand it over.
Hand it over, and worse, the city's going to be burned down. Total destruction for the capital. That part's completely unambiguous.
Okay, so the city's fate is sealed.
Yeah.
What about Zedekiah personally? Does he manage to, slip away in the chaos?
No, the text is very clear on that, too. He will not escape. He's going to be captured, handed over directly to Nebuchadnezzar.
Wow.
And it even says he'll see him face to face, speak with him. Then, off to Babylon. Exile.
Capture, meeting the conqueror, exile. I mean, that sounds pretty final. Probably a grim end, right? But isn't there something, unexpected about how his death is foretold?
Yes. This is where it gets interesting, a real twist. Despite the capture and exile, the prophecy promises Zedekiah he won't die by the sword.
Not by the sword.
No, it says he will die peacefully.
Peacefully. How does that work after being captured by Nebuchadnezzar and dragged off to Babylon? That feels counterintuitive.
It really does, but that's the word given. And it even adds these details, suggesting a measure of respect, maybe. It says they'll make a funeral fire for him, like they did for the kings before him.
A royal funeral fire.
Seems like it. And people will mourn him, lamenting, "Alas, O master!" The text emphasizes this is a direct promise from God. I, myself, make this promise.
So, okay, the city burns, he's captured, exiled, but his personal death is prophesied as peaceful with traditional honors. That's a really sharp contrast, isn't it? His fate versus the city's.
It is. It kind of highlights that even in a sweeping judgment, there can be these specific, maybe even slightly merciful nuances for individuals. Though, let's be clear, capture and exile are still his definite future. It just sets his end apart from, say, dying violently in the siege.
Okay, so that's the message to the king. The siege is ongoing. Lachish and Azekah are still fighting. But then the chapter shifts gears, doesn't it? It moves from the external threat to something happening inside Jerusalem, among the people themselves, something about slaves.
Exactly. The focus pivots. We're told that after King Zedekiah and, basically everyone in Jerusalem made this big agreement, a covenant.
A covenant? What about?
To free their slaves, specifically their Hebrew slaves.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so after they made this covenant, then another message comes from God via Jeremiah. The timing is important.
So what was the deal with this covenant? What exactly did they agree to?
It was a pledge to essentially end indentured servitude among their own people. The terms were clear. Everyone had to free their Hebrew male and female slaves. The idea was that no Jew should hold another Jew in bondage. It was quite a radical social act, especially then.
And did they just talk about it, or did they actually follow through?
That's the crucial bit. The text says they did follow through initially. The officials, the people, they all agreed to the covenant. And importantly, it says they set the slaves free.
They actually did it.
Yes. They took the action, fulfilled the promise, at least for a little while.
So they make this public, solemn agreement. They act on it, free people. That sounds like, a moment of doing the right thing, maybe trying to get right with God during the siege.
You'd think so. It seems like a positive step. But then comes the twist, the really dark turn that triggers the next part of the chapter. The text says, afterward.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Afterward, they changed their minds. They went back on it. They took back the very slaves they had just freed and forced them back into slavery.
They changed their minds, just like that. After a formal covenant and actually letting people go,
yeah.
That's astounding bad faith.
It's presented as exactly that. A huge deal. A solemn promise made, acted upon, and then completely reneged on, taking back the freedom they'd granted.
And that's what prompts the next message from God, this specific act of reversal.
Precisely. This new word from the Lord is a direct response to them breaking this specific covenant. And he starts by reminding them of the original command.
What original command?
The one given way back when their ancestors came out of Egypt, about freeing Hebrew slaves after 6 years, letting them go in the 7th year. The text points out their ancestors didn't really listen back then either.
So this wasn't some new demand. It was an old principle they'd ignored.
Exactly. But then God contrasts that past failure with what they just did. He actually acknowledges, recently you repented and did what was right in my sight. Each of you proclaimed freedom. And he stresses they made this covenant before him, in the temple, the house that bears my name.
So he saw it. He recognized that moment when they did try to do the right thing, making the promise right there in the temple.
He did. That moment of righteousness is noted. But then comes the condemnation for reversing it. But now you have turned around and profaned my name by taking back the slaves they'd freed.
Profaned his name.
How?
By making that promise in his house, invoking his presence, and then treating it like it meant nothing, forcing people back into bondage after declaring them free before him. It's presented as a direct insult, a violation of the sanctity of the promise made in his name. Wow, okay. Profaning his name by breaking a promise about people made in his own house. So what are the consequences for this specific failure?
The consequences are delivered with this really biting divine irony. Since they refuse to obey and proclaim freedom for their fellow countrymen,
Yeah.
God says he will now proclaim freedom for them, but his kind of freedom is terrifying.
What kind is that?
Freedom to fall by the sword, by plague, by famine, complete disaster, and the result. They'll be scattered, made abhorrent to all the kingdoms of the earth.
So their failure to grant freedom leads to their freedom to be destroyed and dispersed. The text is drawing a direct, harsh line there, isn't it, between their ethical failure inside the city and the disaster coming from outside.
Absolutely. It slams home how seriously this text views the breaking of this particular covenant, one about liberating the vulnerable made so solemnly. It ties their ethical behavior directly to their national survival. Breaking this wasn't just, bad social policy. It was presented as a fundamental violation with catastrophic consequences.
And it gets even more specific, doesn't it? Linking the punishment back to the ceremony they used for the covenant. Something about cutting up a calf.
Yes, exactly. It brings in this really graphic, symbolic punishment tied to how they sealed the deal. The text mentions they cut a calf in two and walked between the pieces.
Why would they do that?
It was an ancient ritual for making a super serious oath. By walking between the pieces, they were essentially saying, if I break this oath, may I end up like this animal cut in two, destroyed. It was a self-curse if they failed to keep the promise.
Okay, so they performed this ritual, invoking that consequence on themselves if they broke the deal, and then they broke the deal.
Precisely. They walked right into the symbolism of their own punishment. And the text is specific.
Yeah.
The leaders, the officials, the priests, all the people who walked between those pieces and then went back on the covenant.
What happens to them linked to that calf?
They will be handed over to their enemies, the ones seeking their lives. And really gruesomely, their dead bodies will become food for birds and wild animals.
Oh, wow. Left unburied.
Yes. Total dishonor on top of death. A direct fulfillment of the kind of destruction invoked by the split calf.
That's incredibly stark imagery. And this fate, this specific punishment, it applies even to King Zedekiah and his officials too.
Explicitly, the text says, Zedekiah, king of Judah, and his officials, I will hand over to their enemies, to the army of the king of Babylon. It connects the leadership's fate directly to the fallout from breaking this specific promise about the slaves.
And this brings us back to the Babylonians, the siege. You mentioned something crucial. The text says the Babylonian army had actually pulled back for a bit.
Yes, that's a really key plot point here. It notes the Babylonians had withdrawn from Jerusalem, maybe dealing with Egyptians, maybe a strategic pause, we don't know why exactly, but there was a moment, a potential reprieve.
A breather. But then,
because the people broke the covenant about the slaves, the message from God is, I'm going to give the order, and I will bring them back to the city.
so the broken promise, that internal ethical failure, is presented as the very thing that reversed the withdrawal. It canceled out their potential break and sealed the city's doom.
That's exactly how the narrative frames it. Because they reneged on the covenant made before him, God declares the Babylonians will come back, they will fight, they will take the city, and they will burn it. And it extends beyond Jerusalem, the towns of Judah laid waste. The failure to uphold that solemn ethical promise is shown to be the direct trigger for the final, unavoidable destruction.
Okay, so we've walked through this intense chapter, Jeremiah 34. What does this ancient story, with its prophecies, broken promises, dramatic consequences, what does it maybe offer us or you listening today to think about?
Well, it certainly makes you consider the weight of promises, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Covenants, commitments, especially ones made publicly or maybe with a sense of higher accountability. How seriously do we take them?
Yeah, not just as like legal contracts, but something more.
Perhaps. And that reversal, doing the right thing, freeing people, and then snatching it back for presumably self-interest or convenience, it's such
Mhm.
a stark picture of hypocrisy.
It really is. Makes you think about when we might rationalize going back on our word, especially when it affects others' well-being or justice.
Exactly. And the text draws this incredibly direct, almost uncomfortable line. Breaking this specific ethical command re-enslaving people leads straight to disaster from an external enemy. So it pushes you to ask, what does that suggest about accountability today? Not just individually, but maybe collectively.
You mean how might our own internal failures, maybe societal failures in justice or ethics, make us more vulnerable to external problems or crises?
That's the kind of challenging question the text leaves you with. How much do our internal actions influence our external realities?
A heavy thought.
Eh,
So, just to recap for everyone, we saw the prophecy for Zedekiah capture, exile, but a peaceful death. Then the big covenant to free the Hebrew slaves,
which they initially honored, making it before God in the temple.
only to completely reverse course and re-enslave them, which led to that stark judgment, the ironic freedom to disaster linked to the calf ceremony.
And ultimately triggering the return of the Babylonians to finish the job, destroy Jerusalem, and devastate Judah.
Right. It's a powerful sequence.
And maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. The chapter frames the ultimate destruction not just as something imposed by Babylon, but as something fundamentally enabled, even caused, by an internal failure within Judah itself. The breaking of that covenant about the slaves is presented as the fatal mistake that sealed their fate.
So it wasn't just about the enemy outside the walls.
No, the text suggests the critical vulnerability came from within, from a failure of integrity, a failure to uphold a basic ethical commitment made before God and each other. It really makes you ponder how much our internal societal health, our ethical core, impacts our ability to withstand external pressures. Something to think about.